All right, welcome everybody to our discussion today of the crisis in Ukraine. My name is Bill Bush, and I'm a professor and chair of history at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. I will be moderating today's session. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the land where I am, the Yanaguana, named for the life-giving waters of the San Antonio River. Indigenous peoples have lived in this area for approximately 10,000 years, including the Payaya, Coahuiltecan, Lipan Apache, and Comanche, as well as other diasporic peoples from Mexico, the Southern Plains, and the Eastern United States. Our goal today is to provide our campus community with some background information that will help people make sense of the ongoing terrible events of the past week in the area around Russia and Ukraine. In the United States, people from all walks of life and political persuasions are rightfully concerned about the events in Ukraine. They're worried, not only because of the terrible human toll that we are seeing on our screens and reading about in news reports, but because we know instinctively that, as Dr. King once said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Russia's invasion of a democratic neighbor threatens the idea that ordinary people should have the right to govern themselves through elected representatives, freedom of thought and expression, and opportunity to better their lives and those of their loved ones and communities. During our session, I will ask questions of our panelists about the historical and proximate causes of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which began a week ago, as well as the global response and what we might expect to happen next. During our discussion, you can post questions for our panelists using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will select questions to read to our panelists. Today's session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the university's social media feeds. We're fortunate today to be joined by two outstanding scholars from A&M San Antonio who can help us make sense of the Ukraine crisis. I will introduce them and then we'll get started. First up is Dr. Edward Westerman, Regents Professor of History. Dr. Westerman is an internationally known scholar of modern European history, military history, the Nazi Holocaust, and comparative genocide studies. He has published 4 books, 2 co-edited volumes, and over 40 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on these topics. His most recent book, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, was published in 2021 by Cornell University Press and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Welcome, Dr. Westerman.
Thank you.
Next up is our second panelist, Dr. Andrew Sanders, an assistant professor of political science. Dr. Sanders specializes in international conflict studies. He has published 3 books and numerous books and articles and book chapters on the historic struggles between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. His most recent book, The Long Peace Process, The United States of America and Northern Ireland, 1960 to 2000, was published in 2019 by Liverpool University Press. Welcome, Dr. Sanders.
Thanks.
So my first question for you is really a very basic introductory one for our audience. Can you provide us with a short recap of the recent events that led directly to Russia's invasion of Ukraine last week? Either one of you.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll start off. So yes, thanks to everyone for attending, and hopefully the session is informative and useful. And as Bill said, please do send your questions in. So as all of us will be aware, Russia invaded Ukraine last week. The invasions centered initially on the southeastern region of Ukraine, which is known as the Donbass region, around the large cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, and subsequently evolved to invasions from the Ukrainian border to the north, its border with Belarus. And those forces initially fought at Chernobyl, at the abandoned former nuclear power plant, and have headed in and have started to besiege the city of Kiev. And essentially what has been going on there has been serious conflict You can see here from this map, so the red areas represent the areas that are under Russian control. And you can see there Russia is moving along the coast of the Black Sea. Obviously, the city of Kharkiv has seen serious violence. And, as I mentioned a moment ago, Kiev is currently being besieged. Belarus borders all the way to the western border of Ukraine, as you can see on that map. So even cities like Lviv, which have been a sanctuary for people trying to flee violence in the east of the country, are also under threat. Putin claimed that he was invading as a peacekeeping force. He claims that ethnically Russian separatists in the Donbass region needed his help, as it were. And that was one of his initial justifications. The justification from Putin for the invasion of Kiev is to overthrow the government and install what would essentially amount to a puppet regime. Since then, Russia has come under serious sanctions. That's been one of the major Western responses, and arms have been flowing, weaponry have been flowing to the Ukrainians from all around the West. I'll pass over to Ed. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that does a great job of kind of framing where we currently are. I think that historically, we have to look at World War I and World War II in framing this conflict as well. World War I, because of the Bolshevik Revolution and the creation of one of an independent state, which was Ukraine, that was independent in 1920, that then voluntarily joined the Soviet Union as a Soviet Socialist Republic at that time. The reason I'm making that point is because Putin has argued that Ukraine was essentially not a state itself, not an independent state. So in fact, we know that Ukraine was an independent state, that it in fact did join the Soviet Socialist Republics. It did fight, obviously, in World War II, and the shadow of World War II on this conflict is really important. Because Ukraine was at the center of the Nazi invasion into Europe in that time, into Eastern Europe. It was going to be the so-called Garden of Eden for the Nazis to create this chain of settlements and farmer settlements. It also involved the murder of about 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because when Putin has used the idea that he's in Ukraine to denazify and to demilitarize Ukraine, that's really a very problematic statement. Because in fact, one of the things that we see about the current Ukrainian situation, it's one of the most democratic countries to evolve out of that Eastern European orbit, and it's gone through its own revolution, and it's gone through its own semi-autocratic leaders to reach the position at today. I think that's, again, an important thing to talk about. As Dr. Sanders also mentioned, this idea of what Putin is talking about is this is to prevent what he terms genocide, and the genocide of Russian-speaking peoples. And from a historical perspective, Russification of the Soviet Socialist republics was a major emphasis of Soviet rule in that time period. And the reason he's using genocide, for those who may not be familiar with UN Resolution 260, is because the resolution says that all member states of the UN, if they determine that genocide is occurring, are obligated to prevent and to punish genocide. So he's using this in a very cynical way to use the Russian minority as a way to essentially substantiate his operations into Ukraine.
Thank you. And since you mentioned the Bolshevik Revolution, can you maybe bring us forward a little bit and talk about the Cold War and how the relations between Russia and Ukraine evolved during the Cold War?
Well, I think this is another really important point to understand. So the dissolution of the Soviet Empire in 1991, and those Soviet Socialist republics that became independent states, in the case of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they regained their freedom that was taken from them as a result of a Nazi Germany and Soviet pact against Poland in 1939. So that's an important context. Ukraine itself developed into an independent and took an independent state role. But what many people have not been mentioning is in 1994, Ukraine was faced with a decision. They were told, as the third largest nuclear power in the world in 1994, they agreed to sign a memorandum to divest themselves of their nuclear weapons, which were Soviet era nuclear weapons, to voluntarily give those weapons over. And in a Bucharest memo of 1994, they were therefore guaranteed their state sovereignty as a result of that. And Russia signed that, the United States signed that declaration as well. And this is an issue that has been really kind of elided over in the press. That was a guarantee of state sovereignty for Ukraine at that time.
Dr. Sanders, did you want to add anything to that? Other events in the 1990s that we should know to help us understand the current situation?
Well, really, I would be bringing it forward a little bit into the 2000s, but certainly I'll add, that 2008, there were conversations about NATO expansion, and former Soviet states, Ukraine being one of them, were essentially beginning the process. Ukraine back.
Can I stop you real quick?
Yeah.
I know that some of the members of our audience are not going to know what NATO is. Can you just very quickly explain what NATO is, what that acronym stands for, why it was formed, why its expansion was so significant as its mission changed after the Cold War?
Well, I think that might be more of a Professor Westerman question, so I'll pick up from him.
Okay, well, NATO was formed as a defensive alliance in 1949, and it was part of the Cold War. It was the realization that after World War II, that once allies, the Soviet Union with Great Britain and the United States and France during World War II, had in fact become separate blocs. And so NATO was formed. The Warsaw Pact was a alliance formed by those powers in the Soviet orbit, including countries like Romania, including countries like Hungary that were part of that, East Germany that was part of that. So essentially, you had a defensive alliance, and Article 5 was the central article in NATO. It said if one NATO member was attacked, all NATO members were obligated in the spirit of collective security to act on their behalf. So this was a guarantee for stability and balancing, if you will, in Europe at the time. NATO expansion became an issue after the fall of the Soviet Union, as other countries in Eastern Europe were looking for security guarantees and also economic relations with the European Union. So you saw this come together. Now, I do have to say that when the reunification of Germany was negotiated, the so-called 2+4 agreement, it was negotiated under the idea that NATO troops would not be in what would be the former Eastern Germany, that they would not be allowed there. And what we see in that intervening period, however, is that a number of countries want to join the Western European, if you will, tradition, economic union, and ultimately looking for defense guarantees in Eastern Europe as well.
So that I'll pick up from there. 2008 is when Ukraine started the conversations. That was subsequently dropped. During that period, though, a number of former Soviet states, most notably the Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as Poland, these states all became Europeanized, if you will. So NATO membership, application to join the European Union as well, both of which have become very important issues today, because Ukraine has applied to join the European Union. The European Parliament is talking about expediting that process. Usually there's a number of requirements of a state to join the EU, as there are of NATO, as we heard. Georgia, another state, is seeking NATO membership. And there's all these other impacts of this. And obviously we understand that for Putin to expand his invasion beyond the Ukraine borders would almost certainly be to attack a NATO member state, which brings us back to what we were just saying. So really the expansion of NATO and the expansion of the European Union are really the two big international issues that are going to have an impact on what happens from here.
And I would just ask another sort of background question for our audience. I think most of the people in our audience here today have heard of Vladimir Putin and know he's the president of Russia, but they probably don't know a whole lot about what happened in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union and how Putin kind of rose to power in Russia and what kind of society, what kind of political regime exists in Russia under Putin's leadership.
Yeah, I think it's very important, and many of the viewers would not necessarily know this, but Vladimir Putin was actually in Dresden in Eastern Germany when Eastern Germany essentially voted for reunification or protested for reunification with Western Germany at the time, with West Germany. I think that's a very important point because there's a story of him at the KGB headquarters. He's a secret policeman. He was part of the security police apparatus at the KGB at the time. And this loss of this kind of Russian sphere of influence, especially, I think, is something that he witnessed very personally. And it also became something that affected his mindset. He was subsequently able to get close to Boris Yeltsin during the independence of Russia and became a key advisor in that case. But it was also very clear that his connections with the secret police apparatus really facilitated his rise to power. And his election to president was facilitated by the creation of what's known in many circles as a kleptocracy, the idea that you have these so-called oligarchs, a small group, the top group of being about 5, but there's many sub-levels of the oligarchs who essentially are in control of Russian politics and the Russian economy, with Putin at the top.
Thank you. So moving ahead now, in March of 2014, Russia invaded the Crimea. And let me put the map up here again that I had up just a few minutes ago. Right, so you see the Crimea on the bottom there of Ukraine. In March of 2014, Russia invaded Crimea, this peninsula in the south of Ukraine. The invasion was denounced internationally as an act of unprovoked aggression. Controversially, one American scholar, University of Chicago political scientist named John Mearsheimer, argued that NATO expansion had provoked Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea. So this kind of argument is being touted now by defenders of Russia's current invasion of Ukraine. First, I would just ask, evaluate this argument for us, and if can you explain Russia's actions both in 2014 and now? And you've already touched on a little bit, but maybe go a little further for us.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, first of all, I think, Professor Mearsheimer's very well known in international relations. He's, part of the University of Chicago. He has a really interesting book about the Israeli lobby and its influence on the US. But as you rightly pointed out, he's picking up a lot of criticism because of the way that his arguments from 2014 are being framed today. And I would add that being framed by him, he's interviewed in the New Yorker yesterday, and he doesn't really back down from what he was saying. And really the major criticism of Mearsheimer is that he's denying agency to other groups. He's denying agency for the Ukrainian people. Isaac Chotiner, who's interviewing him for the New Yorker, is saying, well, what if the Ukrainians want to join NATO? They want to join the EU. And one of the key phrases that is used throughout the interview basically is this idea that they're becoming Americanized, right? This idea that it's detracting from their cultural identity. And this kind of plays into one of Putin's arguments. And, we heard that earlier from Professor Westerman, that basically he views the Ukraine as an illegitimate state. It's really Russian, so we're just coming in and making it Russian again. So that's being used there. Obviously, it's important, we're in a time where academic freedom is being challenged ourselves, right? So it's important to understand that there should be a debate, this idea of the marketplace of ideas, and certainly Mersheimer is coming out reasonably empty-handed from that marketplace of ideas right now.
And I think that Professor Sanders makes a really good point here. There's a couple of issues that essentially Putin is thinking about an ethno-linguistic nationalist state. It's an imagined Russia of his mind. And Eastern Ukraine, for example, there are large numbers of Russians. About 25% in Estonia and Latvia as well. So there's a Russian diaspora. But what Putin has done is put himself in this kind of idea of the pan-Russian protector. And his goal is essentially to create a sphere of influence that mirrors what existed during the Cold War, a buffer zone, if you will, in which Russia controls states in that area. The question that was really interesting in my mind is that, in fact, France and Germany have been the major partners in negotiating with Russia throughout this crisis, including the Minsk Accords, where they're trying to settle this dispute in Luhansk and Donetsk and the Donbass. But what's really interesting, and I watched the Bundestag meet in special session last Sunday, for the first time in the history of the Bundestag to have a Sunday meeting. That's the German parliament. And led by Social Democratic Party and by a coalition of the Greens and the Free Democrats, they came out very strongly, reversing course about what this means for European unity and what this means for the European security architecture. So in fact, while there was no threat to Russia through the Ukraine, and the countries that had been most supportive of accommodating Putin and at least working with him are the countries that he has driven literally into a new posture and thinking about a new security architecture because of the threat to European independence writ large.
Thank you. We're starting to get some really good audience questions here, so I'm going to go ahead and read a couple of these to you guys. The first one comes from Mark Kelly. What are the most critical considerations in the United States' decision to send or not to send American troops to Ukraine? Is there a scenario that might emerge that would influence the U.S. to send troops, and what would that be?
Well, if I was answering that, we've already sent troops. So the on the eastern flank, we've already deployed. NATO is already deploying in NATO territory. We've already made the decisions, and this includes Germany, the Netherlands, United States, to supply military equipment, including defensive weaponry, which can be used, Stinger missiles, for example, Javelin anti-tank missiles. So we're in the game. What Ukraine would like is they would like a no-fly zone supported by NATO, which would mean that direct NATO forces could be engaged with Russian forces, and that threatens an escalation spiral. Now, the danger is that something happens on the borders of Poland or Slovakia or Hungary with respect to Russian forces, and that could then change the dynamic of what we're looking at.
Let me ask a quick follow-up to that. How worried should we be about the possibility of nuclear weapons being used in this conflict at some point? I think when you say escalation, that's kind of what that means.
Right, and Putin's already vaguely threatened that kind of escalation as well. And we've had this idea of mutually assured destruction in the back of our minds for, well, quite a long time, right? Some of us, grew up with it. And, certainly it's it's a threat, and this is why diplomacy needs to be at the forefront. I think, you know, as Professor Westerman said, if we declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine and then a Russian plane strays into Ukrainian airspace, then it's going to be shot down. Okay, as soon as we start shooting, you know, we NATO forces, whether that be UK, US, whoever, as soon as we start shooting Russian soldiers, then we're in a war with them. Okay, so that's all very important to realize, and that's why diplomacy is obviously one of our, you know, perhaps our best off-ramp to this conflict, I think.
Yeah, and I would add to that that nuclear brinksmanship, sending Russian nuclear submarines out of their ports, raising alert status, those are symbolic. But the problem is what we don't know is where the end game is and what happens again if there's a misconception or an order that's given that's not completely understood. This is where we start to run into situations, especially with tactical nuclear weapons and their use, that could be a real danger for escalation here. And I think that the question it raises, that really this is how Europe's respond, that they're not going to allow nuclear blackmail to be the answer for European security. Because if this works, if this aggression is not turned back, if it's not reversed, and the next time Putin wants to move into Latvia, Lithuania, wherever it is he wants to go, Moldavia, the idea is if he uses that nuclear threat again, that you're backing down. So this is where it's a very difficult situation and a very dangerous situation, because ultimately that order has to come from Vladimir Putin. That won't come from a lower level, but how it's going to be perceived on the part of his forces, that's another question.
And actually, you've just segued into another question that we received from the audience from Dylan Merton. Could neighboring countries of Ukraine, such as Poland, Hungary, or other states, be invaded by Russia if Ukraine were to fall?
You know, and good to see you in the talk, Dylan. Dylan's been one of my students over a few classes. And thanks for the question. That's always the risk. You know, a lot of experts don't think that Putin's plans right now extend beyond Ukraine, but some slightly more senior Cold War scholars are speculating that he's lost his mind. You know, why is he doing this? What's the justification for this? What does he think is the end game? And that unpredictability, as Professor Westerman just said, that's a big risk. You know, we don't like having this unpredictability, and it's really hard to say. This is why we have troops in Eastern Poland, and Poland has been arming its eastern flank. You know, my family's from Eastern Poland. You know, you go back 2 generations. My grandfather's from Eastern Poland, which was invaded by the Soviets just before he turned 19. And he spent 2 years in the Soviet prisoner of war camp. So, you know, this is something that is personal for me. Poland has been arming its eastern flank with, you know, all the weaponry we've talked about. And it's something that we are afraid of. And we hope that it doesn't get to that stage. And we hope that there's an off-ramp. And this is why we really need to be very assertive with our diplomacy, but also make sure that there's a way to convince Putin to do something else. And that's going to be critical. Like, how do we get there? Zelensky, we haven't actually mentioned his name yet. We're half an hour in. You know, President Zelensky of Ukraine has offered peace talks. And it's, you know, Zelensky is coming across as a very talented leader at the moment. He's often depicted in our media as, well, he's a comedian. Well, he's also got a law degree, you know, and he's showing himself to be an international diplomat as well. But he's offering peace talks wherever those may be, but he wants Putin to be serious about them. And that's going to be important. So yeah, just again, I would re-emphasize that issue of diplomacy.
And this comes, I think, to another issue, rationality and irrationality. And the idea, is he a rational actor? One of the things that we do know, he has authorized targeted killings in the United Kingdom involving nerve agents, involving radioactive materials. He's done it in Germany and Munich as well. He's poisoned individuals within his own country. Alexei Navalny, for example, who is now imprisoned there. Aleppo and the bombing in Syria with barrel bombs, for example. this is where we really are in uncharted territory, because the question of rationality is also tied to survival. And one of the things historians hate to do is make predictions because we're always wrong. But my feeling is he's already lost his position of power. It's just a question of how it's going to play out. That I don't think that the isolation of the Russian state is going to mean the end of Putin's power. But the question is, who's he going to try to take with him, or what's he going to try to do that? That's my greatest fear.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got, I think, 2 or 3 different questions about China, and I'm going to try to combine them here into a couple of brief questions. They seem to be focusing on really 2 things. One, I think they want to hear from you about how your sort of assessment of China's response to the crisis. And then a secondary question is what the impact of the invasion of Ukraine might have on China's posture towards Taiwan. So if you would address both of those, however the both of you would see fit.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's worth noting is China just signed a big trade deal with Ukraine in 2019. Okay, that was seen as this goal of their bridge to Europe, which basically gives them establish a trading partnership with Ukraine, prove themselves to the European Union, and increase their trade opportunities there. There's one possible outcome that I was reading about yesterday, which is given the impact the sanctions are going to have on Russia, and they're hitting hard, it's not going to take that long for the Russian economy to essentially collapse, which is going to absolutely cripple ordinary Russians. The oligarchs will be fine. They're seizing their yachts in Germany. They're sinking them in the Mediterranean. I think, if we saw that, somebody sank an oligarch's yacht. Roman Abramovich, who is currently selling Chelsea Football Club, one of the most prominent oligarchs, where I'm from in the UK, affiliated with, as Professor Westerman mentioned, the Alexander Litvinenko poisoning, which happened 15, 16 years ago now. And, everyone's, they're being punished, but China has a couple of things. Firstly, Russia's been excluded from a lot of international financial networks. So SWIFT, for example, well, China has an equivalent, right? So if Russia starts to look east, ultimately, does Russia potentially become a Chinese puppet state, which would be an incredible irony given that Russia is trying to establish its own puppet states, as it has in Belarus, as it's trying to do in Ukraine, as it may try to do in these other locations. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Georgia is anxiously watching this and imagining they could be next. So that's one potential outcome from this. And certainly China is monitoring. They're very kind of non-committal. But I would say that's one potential outcome that I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think this is a great question because the United States, our strategic pivot to the Pacific under the Obama administration was that the Pacific was the growing area, and growing Chinese strength is the area that the United States and the free world needs to look at very closely. But I do think that China provides a real off-ramp here because Chinese strategic policy takes the long view. They don't think in terms of 2 years and 4 years. They're thinking in terms of where are they going to be in 25 or 50 years. And their goal is to be a regional hegemon and to be a global superpower, if not the global superpower. And what Russia has done, what Putin has done, it threatens that plan, because what he has essentially done is created a new security architecture in Europe that is being built now, that's going to be reinforced, that's going to lead to a weakening and an ostracization of Russia in this case. And China was trying to use Russia, like the United States under Nixon used China, the so-called China card, to balance Russian power. And so not only are they losing a power that they were using as a balancing power against US global power, but the current events are threatening their strategic outlook and their strategic goals in the near term. And so I think that how this plays out with China is important. And one should note that China abstained, did not veto the resolution on the Security Council, and also abstained in the non-binding resolution in which 141 countries voted against to censure Russia and demand immediate withdrawal of all troops from Ukraine. 141-5 with 35 extensions. The United Nations has not had a single vote of that magnitude in that solidarity. So it is an amazing vote. And for us here in Texas, for example, Mexico voted to censure Russia. Now they're not joining in economic sanctions, and President Lopez Obrador already talked about why that's not happening. But again, it shows, I think, a world community that is being pretty strong in support of Ukrainian independence.
There's actually an interesting UN question as well, which was discussed last week, and that's whether or not Russia deserved to inherit the Soviet Union's seat at the table in the UN, right? When the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia stepped in, but there are questions being asked. Obviously, Russia's the largest, it has the most people, but that was a question that was asked as well last week.
You're talking specifically about their seat on the Security Council. And
Right,
you might just sort of briefly explain to our audience what the significance of the Security Council is, because that really is huge.
Sure. Well, basically Russia can veto, well, Russia has been vetoing Security Council resolutions against itself over this week. Russia is one of the major powers at the UN, and with that veto, it inhibits a lot of UN actions, because basically, as of right now, if the UN was having a discussion as they did, we're going to do something about Russia, Russia just says no, and they have a veto. And perhaps Professor Westerman wants to add to the sort of historic dimension there.
No, I think it's a good point. For those who don't remember the Korean War, it's often called the Forgotten War. One of the reasons that the UN was able to send forces into South Korea was because the Russians, in this case the Soviet Union, had been boycotting the Security Council, and that allowed for the vote to pass without a veto. In short, it's a very powerful body if those who have the permanent members who have the veto don't use the veto. Yeah, it's an important symbolic body. That's why that non-binding resolution was so important, because you can't force it, but it sent a very clear message about the resolve of the world community.
Yeah, the permanent members of the UN Security Council are ourselves, the US, UK, France, China, and then the other permanent members, Russia.
So we have another sort of category of question here where we've had about 2 or 3 questions specifically about the sanctions regime and the effectiveness of the sanctions regime. You've already touched on it a little bit, but I wonder if maybe you could go into a little more detail and illustrate some of the unprecedented types of sanctions that have been levied and how they will, or if maybe already have, impacted Russian society. For example, you might explain a little more what SWIFT is and why it's so significant.
Really what's happening is Russia's being excluded from international finance networks, and that's important because a lot of Russian assets are held outside of Russia. I believe about 1/3 of Russia's overseas assets are held in euro, and then US dollar is maybe about half as much. And basically what's happening is the international community is saying to Russia, these assets, now it's important to remember Putin was stockpiling assets ahead of now in anticipation that there may be some softer sanctions, because he would still have, I think they talked about $600 billion worth stockpile to protect him and essentially make him sanction proof. He would still have this money which he could use. And the international community is essentially saying, look, if it's Russian, it's no good. And, they're basically turning the ruble. Somebody compared it to a junk cryptocurrency, right? It's basically becoming so worthless. And now this is going to hit the whole country. It's going to hit regular Russians hardest, right? They're the ones that are going to suffer the most. As I mentioned, the oligarchs are just laundering their money right now. They're going to transfer it to something else, and they'll ultimately be okay. But some states, Alisher Usmanov had his $450 million yacht seized in Hamburg. You can look at pictures of that right now. The Germans seized it. And if the UK follows suit, now the UK is important because it's not part of the European Union anymore. So it's kind of doing its own, I say it, we, I mean, I'm British, kind of doing its own thing. But London was one of the first places that a lot of these oligarchs started to invest in property. You see it in New York as well, but they've been calling it, you know, like Mayfair is kind of oligarchs row and those kind of things. And you all know Mayfair from playing Monopoly, I'm sure, over the years, assuming you kids still play Monopoly, but, you know, very expensive part of London. And the oligarchs have been buying up property there and, you know, heavily invested in London. The UK currently anticipates implementing sanctions that won't really take place for 18 months. So essentially useless. But there are some sanctions in place. There's debate in the House of Commons about doing that. So really, to kind of summarize, it's turning Russian assets into dust for right now. And obviously those can be reversed, but that's one of the big impacts that it'll have.
Yeah, and I would point out that if you look at the Russian economy, it's 1/15 the GDP of the United States. It's 3% that of the United States combined with the European Union. So if we look at economic power in Russia, it's actually on a global scale not that significant compared to the actors who are acting against it. And I think that that's a really important point because there's a lot of economic leverage. But Professor Sanders' point about who it's going to hit the hardest is going to be pensioners. It's going to be people on fixed incomes. Now, the problem with that is Russian media is controlled by the Russian state. And there's a generational divide in the way that Russians are getting information about this war. But that generational divide, you need to remember that those who are my age or a little bit younger and a little bit older remember the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which they see as a national humiliation, their fall from great power status. And this is some of the propaganda that Putin is using to try to use nationalism in a way that people will say they're less worried about their economic checkbook, if you will, of what's in the bank, but they're going to be, again, proud Russians and strong Russians again. And that's been a message other totalitarian leaders have used at other times as well with great effect.
And also, it's worth noting that one of the things that hasn't really been sanctioned yet is Russian energy, especially gas. Now, you're seeing some symbolism. You know, there are soccer teams in Europe that are sponsored by Gazprom. They've been covering that logo on their shirts. Schalke, this German side, had covered Gazprom on their shirts the other night. Now, a lot of Western Europe is reliant on supplies, especially natural gas from Russia. But whether or not they're able to mitigate that somehow, this is going to be important because that is a significant chunk of the Russian economy, as Professor Westerman just mentioned. The Russian economy is not huge. It's actually their GDP for 2020 is 1.43 trillion US dollars. The GDP of Texas last year was $2 trillion. So, you know, comparatively speaking, it's not this international power, but heavily reliant on oil and gas, especially across southern and central Russia into those states, you know, Kazakhstan, places like that. There's also going to be impact on some of these other states in the area. You know, I was reading about Tajikistan earlier today. You know, it's heavily dependent on aid from Russia, and the impact in Tajikistan, which borders Afghanistan, also borders China, by the way. That's going to be significant. So that's going to start to shift some of these states towards China. Is Tajikistan going to create negotiations with China to try and make up the shortfall, because Putin just isn't going to have the money to keep supporting Tajikistan. Kazakhstan, interestingly, have kind of, at least the last I checked, and as we should be conscious of, this is an evolving situation. So even by the time we finish today, some of the things we said might have changed. But Kazakhstan, which is a major oil producing state in Central Asia, they hadn't committed to supporting the Russians. They weren't going to send troops significantly to go to Ukraine. And that's obviously some indication that Putin is really acting by himself. He's apparently lost a lot of support from within his circle of advisors. And you're also seeing lack of support from these otherwise allied states. So this is all fairly significant, but a lot of this still has to play out.
I want to jump on something that Dr. Westerman said a few minutes ago, because we actually had a question about it. And that was when you pointed out there was a generational divide in how people in Russia are getting their information. So one of our questioners asks to comment on how social media seems to be transcending borders of censorship. Now, my understanding is that Russia still is able to pretty tightly control even its social media feeds. But this person says President Zelensky of Ukraine, certainly understands its power and is effective in using it. Do ordinary Russian citizens see unfettered social media? And if so, what do you think its impact might be?
Well, I would definitely say it's based on age group. It's based on cohort. So, for example, Russian youth are using what they call Telegram is their platform. They're using TikTok. They are able to use Twitter still, although the Twitter feed has been slowed down by the state. The state is now blocking specific websites and content in Russia. So they've also had two independent media outlets that have now been told to shut down, have had to shut down. And the Russian parliament is actually looking at a law with a 15-year sentence for people who create fake news, i.e. call this a war instead of a special military operation. So what we're seeing is that people, let's say 50 and older, or even maybe a little bit younger and older, are looking at state media, television primarily, Russian Today, and they're getting very much this idea of genocide occurring, Russian forces going in to save Russian peoples, that the U.S. Is sponsoring this in kind of, if you will, a new kind of Germanic Nazi power in the United States is driving this kind of dissension, and it's aimed at toppling Russia, right? So the demographics are good if your demographics are younger. The problem is that's not the majority. And the other problem is Putin has created essentially a 400,000 man National Guard that he's employing as a paramilitary force to go on the streets of St. Petersburg and Moscow and other areas and to beat and to find and to imprison young people, especially, or old people who are willing to risk going out on the street and protest against the war.
Yeah, another thing that's worth adding to that social media point is that, Professor Westman mentioned TikTok. Well, perhaps we all remember, perhaps we don't, but that's Chinese owned. So again, thinking about that Chinese long game, this is one of the most prevalent forms of social media. You may remember, I've lost my train of time, but when that came out, there was a lot of talk about, well, TikTok, you're given it permission to access all the information on your phone. Remember that? And that's all going to China. Well, now TikTok is so influential and it's being used during this conflict. And it's actually something we talk about in my classes, particularly classes on conflict. And you think about, what would other conflicts have looked like had we had social media, had we had these minute by minute updates from the streets and that micro history of all these events, but also, we all know, we can all probably think of examples of a situation where we've been following a breaking news story on social media, and this is happening and that's happening, and none of it really makes sense. So there's that additional, yes, you're getting a lot of information, you're hearing about people's perceptions, but then also in the chaos of the event, are we getting good information? And then also you have to factor in trolls. Putin has made extensive use of social media to disrupt our elections here, right? And that's also significant. So yes, I agree that that's a hugely important topic, and something that I really think, we need to figure out as a society going forward, exactly what the role of social media is, and how do we not necessarily control it, but it's something that we do need to discuss and think about.
Thank you. Another category of question we're seeing, we have two different questions asking what potential ramifications there might be in the Western Hemisphere, and referencing Russian military assets in the Caribbean and in Latin America, and whether that could somehow come into play for the United States.
Well, I think if I was in Venezuela, right, I think that they're watching this very closely as well. And what's interesting, Cuba, for example, did not abstain from the vote in the UN and the non-binding resolution. So even traditional allies, I think, are being very careful about this, because the one thing that Russia can offer is either energy or military hardware, and that's been their major exports. And for us in the United States or in Mexico or Canada or anywhere in South America, I think the real issue is going to be what does increased gas prices and oil prices mean for countries experiencing inflationary pressures already? What's going to happen to a global supply chain that's already been impacted by COVID and other shortages? Is this going to either relieve some of that pressure potentially, or is it going to exacerbate some of those pressures? And I think those are very open. I do think that countries, for example, in the case of if we look at West Texas, the oil fields above $55 a barrel, it becomes profitable to start oil wells again. So we're going to probably see some of that. I think Mexico is a partner with gas and oil reserves. That's going to be an important issue as well. So I think, that inflation in the short term, we're already seeing it at the gas pump, and that inflation in the short term is also landing on top of an inflationary spiral that we're already experiencing now. So there's going to be some pain, I think, economically for people as a result of this.
Yeah, there's definitely also, I think, going to need to be conversations about transitioning away from fossil fuels as well. We see how problematic it is that Europe is so reliant on Russian fossil fuels. So that's significant. And there was a quote that I wanted to mention. That's something I was reading just before we came on, trying to do some prep, make sure I was up to date. But I was reading a blog by one of my colleagues, and he cites Woodrow Wilson's idea of peace without victory. Right? Is this something that we can arrive at? Can we get to a point where there's peace, but without necessarily victory? And thinking about what that means, thinking about those Russian assets that are overseas. Obviously, those are predominantly in former Soviet states. Officially, a lot of those Caribbean assets are not active officially. But certainly around some of those former Soviet states, and thinking, as I mentioned before, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, these places, and exactly what those what's going to be the future for those assets, and that's going to be a big question too.
One last topical question, and then we'll get to kind of some closing remarks. We also have about 2 or 3 different questions that really focus on Russia's military and what we're seeing kind of on the ground right now in Ukraine, with the numbers of Russian casualties, with reports that many of the troops really weren't informed about what they were going to be doing until they actually started the invasion. And essentially this sort of question about the morale of the troops. And I think this ties into what some of the questioners are asking about, which is, and something you've already touched on, unrest and dissent within the ranks and within Russian society.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ed.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and I would say one of the surprising things about this campaign, and I think it's surprising for the Russian general staff, and it's been surprising for Putin, is how difficult it's been to employ Russian military force just across that border into Ukraine. And your map kind of showed it. Its ability to take and maintain control of a territory about the size of Texas is going to be very difficult. And one of the things that both Professor Sanders and I planning to teach a course that looks at state violence and policing. And if you look at, for example, how 100,000 troops, Soviet troops, were in Afghanistan, 100,000, and could not control Afghanistan except with air power. They hunkered down in their outposts. Now, the terrain of Afghanistan is a little bit different, but I would tell you, a nation of 40 million Ukrainians, with the experience that they've gained already in the East, and with the will that they're demonstrating on the ground, the occupation, sustained occupation of Ukraine is going to be an extremely expensive and difficult operation. And the numbers of assets that Russia has lost already, and the amount of money that they put into this operation is not insignificant. So there's going to be some effect of that as well.
Yeah, no doubt. My colleague, Dr. Naz, sent me some data that she was reviewing earlier today. And, the reported civilian death toll in Ukraine is huge. There's only, I think, 9 conflicts where there's been a higher death toll in a year than we've seen in Ukraine in a week. This raises the question of war crimes and whether or not Russia is actively committing war crimes. We're seeing on social media videos that suggest that that's happening. Obviously, this is a long process. Are we still actively prosecuting Nazis, Professor Westerman? Is there anyone currently being prosecuted?
If they're still alive and they can be found, yes, they're subject to prosecution.
So this is a long process, and obviously one of the recent conflicts that we've seen these sort of prosecutions in include Rwanda and in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And this is something that I think is important. The Yugoslavian example that perhaps we could have mentioned earlier, that the Russians have talked about the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, 1999. And the Chinese still talk about this as well. And it's something that we could have brought up earlier, but there's so much going on, it's hard to remember everything. But those were NATO forces that bombed the Chinese embassy. And there's questions being asked about the legitimacy of the actions of other forces going into other areas and resolving other conflicts. And I wonder if one of the places that we might learn the most lessons from is what happened in the former Yugoslavia, particularly in Bosnia. And that's one of these kind of historic examples that we could look at. So yes, I think that there are other questions as well about Putin's support. Now, some people are talking about, well, how is Putin going to be overthrown? Certainly, he has an election due in 2024. Now, he has tweaked the constitution to suit himself already, but he is scheduled to face election then. So the timing of this invasion could be related to that. This is just speculation again, I don't know. But, is he going to have domestic support? Is he losing his allies? And there was a Cold War scholar did a really interesting Twitter thread, and I'm reluctant to recommend Twitter as a source for my students unless you double check who it is that's tweeting the stuff. But he was comparing this with potentially 1964 when Brezhnev came into power, and whether or not this is something that could happen. Some people are speculating, well, there could be somebody with Novichok, for example, could take Putin out. It's hard to see that happening, but these things are all being discussed, perhaps a little bit recklessly by people on social media, but certainly this idea that Putin can retain power in Russia has got to be a big question, particularly with, as we've talked about, the inevitable economic collapse that's going to happen fairly soon.
And I think that that's a great point too, because regardless of how the crisis in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, plays out, the security architecture of Europe is going to be fundamentally changed. And countries like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are going to look, and Germany and others are going to look for more security, and that comes with also costs.
We have just a couple of minutes left. Some of you asked questions about how you could help or get involved. And I would just point out that Dr. Sanders posted a link in the chat. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about what that link is.
Oh yeah, hold on. I think I just posted it in our little private top secret chat
did.
for the host, but I'm going to share it right now in the main chat.
There you go.
There's an article in the Washington Post. If you just Google how to help. Now, our neighbors at, I think Leica is called, the cheesecake place in Alamo Heights, had a big fundraiser over the weekend. They were donating, I think it ended up being almost $73,000 to Ukraine. There is actually a bank account that's been opened to specifically donate to help supply the Ukrainian military, which the National Bank of Ukraine has set up. But, that Washington Post outlet, care.org is a good one, and Doctors Without Borders. There's a lot of good places that you can donate money, or go to Leica and buy a cheesecake, because they just donated a bunch of time and money to this fight, and you can support a local business as well. So if you're only thinking about small contributions, that would be a good place to go.
And what I'd like to ask in the couple of minutes we have remaining for both of you is to maybe sum up why this is important, right? Well, why should Americans care about what is happening right now in Ukraine?
Well, from my perspective, we don't talk about domino theories anymore, but quite frankly, if Russia is successful in this gambit, you will see the potential for a offensive spiral, countries looking at nuclear weapons, for example, as a deterrent mechanism, potentially. I think you'll see the issue of what is economic or nuclear blackmail going to be used in the future. And if it's successful here, it threatens the entire existing European economic structure, which threatens the major trading partner and alliance partner of the United States.
Yeah, and I would just re-emphasize the humanitarian dimension. There's a lot of ordinary people in Ukraine, obviously, but also in Russia and elsewhere across Eastern Europe are going to be suffering incredible hardships as a result of this invasion. And I think that it's important to, in terms of what we can do, I posted a few links in the chat. These are places for donations, but one of the main things I say to my students every semester is just call your congressperson, tell them to think about, exactly how they can contribute to helping to resolve this conflict, but also there's a number of humanitarian crises across the world right now. It's not just in Ukraine, it's not going to be in Russia. So, I would say call your congressperson. I try to get my students to do that every semester. So, do that. And also, Professor Westman and I are here to help advise. As he mentioned, we do have a class planned. We're not sure if that's going to be fall or spring of next academic year, but, come and discuss with us in that class. We think it's going to be a really interesting semester for us.
And we have one of our attendees has asked to speak, and it is our executive director of our university library, Tim Gritton. So Tim, go ahead.
Sorry, I something must have happened. I apologize. That was well done. I'll just say that. I really appreciate you guys. You guys did a great job, and I learned a lot. I didn't mean to raise my hand. I apologize.
Oh, okay. No problem.
Sorry.
Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. And I want to thank all of our attendees and for asking some terrific questions. And I think this was a fantastic, informative discussion. And definitely, if you're a student and you're looking for a class this fall, check out their state violence and policing class, which I think you want to go into more depth about some of these subjects that we discussed today. That would be an opportunity to do it with two, I think, very knowledgeable experts. So thanks very much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.